My friends, good day. It was indeed a difficult ending. In the last video about the accident, so to speak, that took the life of the head of Wagner and a number of his deputies? Well, I was saying that it's very unlikely that this plane was hit by a missile, meaning I ruled out the missile theory. At that time, practically all the media, social or otherwise, were talking about it, as if it was a certainty that a missile brought down this plane. Today, the world rejects that hypothesis. I'm not saying those who suggested it were wrong, just that they were on the wrong track. And if we look at the information available at the time when they made their observations, what did they have? I mean that this thesis was not completely without merit, even if in reality it is unfounded. Subtitling, if we zoom out from this story, if we look only at the available videos, we can support this missile thesis. But if we zoom out from there and consider the video as just one element among others in this complicated story, well, we'll see that the missile thesis is relatively not very credible. And I say this because since that video, I've received a huge number of messages about it. People ask, why aren't you discussing the missile? Today, we're going to move even further away from that theory, and we're going to look at something else that is today. Russia wakes up to the death of this man who was very important in the Russian establishment and military strategy. Not just in Ukraine, but also in the Sahel. He was involved, so now his death comes at a really bad time for the Russian establishment. So it's very unlikely that they were the ones who took him out, as they say. Today, the guy was buried with honors and all that. There are flowers and everything everywhere. But let's go further. What happened? So, if we look at the available data, if we look at the radar feedback, at the time I was on an island, so I had access to very little information, but I had access to the essentials. Today, I can tell you more. This plane lost a wing. It lost its left wing during the flight. It was at flight level 280 and the left wing separated. Wings don't just separate like that on an airliner. So there was an extreme force that caused this wing to be torn off. Now, the wing was found 3 kilometers from the crash site, and then it was taken by the authorities. They put that it was dragged by chains through the forest. They put it on a truck, wrapped it in a green tarp, and then they left. Now, there are images where you can still see them handling that wing, and you start to see some details. You realize what happened. If you look at the wing here, I have a plane. That's not an Embraer. It's a 747, actually. It's a model of a 747. So, what happened? Well, we have our wing, our plane, which is flying like this. And actually, at some point, there's an extreme force that causes this left wing to tear off. So the wing, when it tears off, what happens? What's the aerodynamics? What happens to a plane when the wing tears off? We saw in the story of the Twin Otter in Sinai what happens when half a wing is torn off. We studied the aerodynamics of this situation a bit. So what happens if the whole wing tears off? Let's look at this. The wing will tear off if you watch. So if we look at what the plane does, the plane still has its engines. So the plane will keep its speed. I'll even say more. The plane's speed will tend to increase. Why? Because it will be freed from a huge drag. The wings, to provide lift, also create a massive drag. So when it's freed from that drag, it will tend to pick up speed. By the way, if we look at the track on Flight Radar 24, we can see that there was this very brief acceleration for a few seconds. Well, we can see that the speed, which was around 450 knots, you see, at one point, it goes back up to 513 knots. So the plane increases its speed a bit for a few seconds. What about the wing? What's it doing? The wing, once again, it's the same as the plane. Well, since it sees the positive angle of attack at the start, what's it going to do? Is it going to pitch up? Right, it's going to pitch up sharply, of course. What is it going to do in terms of speed? Will it slow down? It'll likely hit the tail, then take off. If we look at the wing that's in the forest, well, let me show you something. Maybe I'll go here. I'll take this marker. And if you look here on the wing, when it's in the forest, you'll see that there's an impact. There's an impact there. It's on this side of the wing. It's underneath, all right? And I'll show you a bit of what happened. If you see the wing in the forest, it's just lying there, how it fell like that. Forget about the engines. That's not important. There's no engine on the wing of the Embraer. The engines are at the back. But here, I don't have an Embraer model. I had one. It was smashed to pieces by my daughter. Here, it's landed in the forest. It's landed in the grass. And we have an impact here. We have an impact. This impact can't be from the wing falling in the forest. Why? Because the wing is dented on this side. I can accept that because of the impact with the ground, stones, pieces of trees, and so on. I can accept that. But what kind of impact is that? On this side, which is facing the sky. There's no reason for it. Where did this impact come from? It occurred in flight during wing separation. That is to say, look at the animation. Okay, look at it. We have our wing. It separates. Okay, it separates, it settles down, it spins like this. And then it against the tail, which severely damaged the inside of the tail. There's a video that shows it. It's in pieces. All right. It's not just a fall. It was a very violent impact that it took. The wing hit the tail, so the wing will fall and we'll find it on the ground. And with that very characteristic impact on it, the tail is completely crushed by the impact. But also, probably, there's a sort of hollow there. There's a kind of hollow that vibrates, probably comes from the impact at some point against one of the engines. It looks quite a lot like the impact against one of the engines. Now, our plane then is falling. The people inside are killed, and in fact, they are killed. I want to say slowly. That is to say, the fall is relatively slow, so probably the people inside are alive throughout this fall, and that was probably intended by those who carried out this act of sabotage against the plane. Because we're going to get there. So, probably they didn't want to blow up the plane, because if they wanted to blow up the plane and kill everyone at once, they would have used a large enough or generous amount of explosives so that the plane would be pulverized. They didn't choose that option. They chose a more minimalist option, which allows the wing to be torn off. But at the same time, not to damage the rest of the plane, which will fall back down. All right, so what do we have? What do we have? If we look at flight radar again, they'll show that the aircraft, suddenly they'll show. He has a graph that shows the last 32 seconds. I'll put it on the screen for you. Well, what do we see? First, the plane climbs sharply, rising from 28,000 to over 30,000 feet in seconds. It drops to 28,000 feet, dips slightly lower, climbs, then descends again. If you look, these altitude changes are too fast to be, as you guessed, to be real. In fact, these are artifacts. That is to say, when the plane starts to spin, probably, this will cause the sensors that measure altitude to be completely disrupted. At times, they will face the airflow, and so they will receive a higher pressure, a static pressure that will be contaminated by dynamic pressure. So it will seem like the altitude has decreased. And then when we have another situation, when we're in a different situation where the air is under pressure, there's a depression. Isn't that right? When the plane moves like this sideways, there's a depression on the other side. This gives the impression that the altitude has increased. In reality, what you see on the flight radar graph regarding this change in altitude with let's say roughly, we see 2 cycles. We basically see 2 cycles that take 10 seconds. That means about 5 seconds per cycle. Basically, the way you should see it is like this. Actually, these are rotation cycles. They're not up and down cycles. They're rotation cycles, actually. Okay, which causes that effect, but then the rotation slows down and the plane keeps losing altitude. Now, Canada, what caused the wing to tear off? So missiles, there were no missiles. Washington finally admits no. They were watching the area and they didn't see any missile launch. The Russians didn't see any missile launch. No one saw that. Especially since if the plane is at 28,000 feet, it wouldn't be a small missile. Like, for example, a Stinger that someone can carry on their shoulder, like the missile that killed back in the day. I'll tell you about that one day. The president of Rwanda, for example, there was actually there were people on the plane, two presidents and everything. And then that's what started that infamous, extremely atrocious story in Rwanda. It began with a private jet crash that killed the president. But actually, it wasn't an accident. It was during the approach, someone hit him with a Stinger. But the Stinger can't reach 28,000 feet, so that means to get to 28,000 feet, you need equipment. You need a missile. That's extremely noticeable. It's hard to imagine a guy walking around in a van with a missile that's big enough to reach those altitudes. There, on the roof of the vehicle, it's not possible. It's not even imaginable, actually. So, such a missile would have been seen. It would have been seen by everyone as well. But that didn't happen. Secondly, when you look at the wings, at least the wing that was found, you can see it. It's clear, it's clean. There isn't a single one. There are no shards. There is no fragmentation on it. There are no shards, no fragmentation. There aren't any. And that's what I used in the last video. There wasn't any on the tail either. There isn't any at all. Not the slightest bit of fragmentation. Statistically, that's the reasoning I used in the last video for missiles releasing thousands of fragments. Well, it's practically impossible on such a small plane to have a fragmentation missile and have zero fragmentation impact on the tail. And here we look at the wing. There is zero impact on it. So really, this hypothesis has been completely ruled out. Today, I'm telling you the story. It's a story that's very complicated. If we look at our plane, it's always doing it. Moscow, St. Petersburg, Moscow, St. Petersburg. In July, it suddenly stops flying. Why? Because it was under maintenance. It went in for maintenance. After that, it comes out of maintenance. It makes a first positioning flight. That means we only have the pilots, probably the pilots, the flight attendant, the crew, who will move without passengers. So they're going to Moscow to pick up the Wagner leaders. And then on the next flight, it explodes. Okay, and everyone is dead. So what we can say is that probably I have some information that I'm going to show you. Probably it was an explosive device that was placed on the plane, probably during maintenance. It was hidden in there, but then it exploded. How did it explode? Why can't we discuss an altimeter triggered detonation? Because the plane had already made a flight, the positioning flight, and probably this equipment was already in there. It didn't explode. It only exploded when the targeted person or people were on the plane. So the Wagner guy and the others were probably just a bonus. Now, it's possible that this kind of equipment was triggered, or at least was activated, through a telephone system, that is a SIM card, a small device, all of that. People who know very, very well what they're doing, actually, those who did this likely saw the plane. Why? Because the guys couldn't just remotely activate the system, hoping that the Wagner guy was inside. Because they didn't take that plane or change his plans at the last minute, and that the aircraft took off empty. Or without him, the people who did this wouldn't have had a second chance. If he had been on the ground, they would have told him his plane exploded in flight. And indeed, having him another time wouldn't have been easy. So, are we saying the people who did it planted a bomb? Because I'm leaning toward the bomb theory, which I'm going to support. In fact, they probably had some guys at the Moscow airport, so probably, if that's the case. If I ran that airport, I would have checked the surveillance cameras, because it's unthinkable that someone would use a phone and set off the system. If he's not sure that the Wagner guy was inside, so probably we have guys who are watching the departure. They see that the Wagner guy is inside. They pick up the phone, they call the system. So it must be something like that. Press 1 to arm the bomb, 2 to detonate it immediately, and similar options. And at some point, the guys, they saw the plane take off, and what did they do? They set a timer, knowing they keep going to Moscow and St. Petersburg, so they set a timer. Like, it's taxiing, we're about to clear it for takeoff. Okay, you set it for 30 minutes, and then it's going to explode in flight at some point. Alright, that's pretty much what happened. So, in terms of traces, there are probably surveillance cameras and the guys who were watching the plane. There are also calls, texts, and exchanges with the SIM card likely on the plane, because once they placed the explosive device, they couldn't go back to the plane. It was just an opportunity to place it. After that, well, that's it. It's over. Why mention this explosive story? There's one key thing you should know. When you look at the images of the wing, especially the wing that's being dragged like that through the forest, what do you see? The wing is already super intact, super clean. The landing gear is down. Look closely. Let me show you something, maybe with a quick drawing. Look, here's the wing. The wing is like this. This is the back of the wing. Okay, it's like this. All right, it's like this. Okay, normally here we have flaps or ailerons or something else. All right, so here we have the front of the wing. What are we going to see? All right, what are we going to see? We're going to see in the images the landing gear that has come out. All right, which is like this. All right, the wing is on the ground. All right, the wing is on the ground. It's like this. How is this wing attached to the Embraer fuselage? There is a system designed for this. There's a box. If you look at the Embraer, you have the fuselage that's like this. There's a box underneath there. There is a box. Okay, it's a very reinforced box. Basically, you find this in all airplanes. We have the wing going out like this and the other wing going out like this. All right, this is the interface I'm showing you. It's right here. So here we have a box section. All right, we have a box section with big bolts. All right, with bolts that go through holes. And actually, we place bolts, and these bolts will attach to the central box section here. So what do we have here? Here we have a big metal panel with holes. So these are holes that are like this. Are they square? Aren't they square? But actually they have a rounded section. Look closely. Square holes with a section and rounded corners. Rounded corners. There are several of them. Take a good look at them. Remember them well in your mind. I'm showing you images from a video I found. It's from 10 years ago about maintenance of a wing of a Lega 6600. The guys removed the wing and replaced it. Why? Because the client, the owner of the plane, that's what he had done. There was a fuel leak. So he tried to pressurize the wing to see where the fuel was coming from. And what he did at one point, by mistake, he created a vacuum. So he sucked the air out from inside the wing, and the wing it imploded, crushing the wing. Afterwards, they sent air inside, but it was ruined. The wing was done for, so it had to be replaced. They found an old Continental Lega 6600 in a junkyard, removed its wing, and put it on another aircraft. And so here we see the detail of how the wing attaches. So we have this. The panel with the holes is right here. All right. Okay. The bomb was placed here. So it was placed where exactly? It was placed in the landing gear compartment, but not inside the compartment itself. That means if someone sticks their head into the compartment, they won't see it. It was placed behind this perforated partition. So it was placed in a specific spot. If I have another color, I can't find the silos anymore. Well, there you go. I found a black silo. So if you look here, the bomb was probably placed there. Okay, in that spot, but not visible from the landing gear. Well, that means it was placed behind this perforated partition. It has holes to allow fuel lines and other systems to pass through. Electrical systems and all that for de-icing the lights, the strobe lights at the wingtip, the navigation lights, etc. So these hatches there. Behind, a bomb was placed, and it was placed behind, also in contact with that compartment, So when it exploded, what did it do? That part is completely shredded. When you see the wing that's dragged through the forest, that part, you don't see it. That part doesn't exist. And why doesn't it exist? Because it blew off. That's where the bomb was. That part was blown away. There's a guy, a local resident, a member of the public, who found a part of this in his garden. And there are probably other pieces that were scattered here and there. They might find it or not. Maybe on a path, rooftop, or elsewhere. And actually, what do we see? We see this part here. We see a piece of this part. So with a square hole, with a section, with an angle, with a rounded angle. And we see that it's a thick part. This area here is thick because it's an area that contributes to the structure. It's very important. It's quite thick. And we see that it's broken. It's completely broken. And on top of that, it's covered in soot. And if we look here as well, if we look here at what's left of the landing gear base, I'm not talking about the wheel. I'm talking about this side. Well, we're actually in a situation where we can see there's a bit of soot here. So there was a bomb that was placed there. And this bomb was just enough to damage the wing, but not necessarily to blow up the plane. There are also panels missing on the wing, which were blown off, probably because we're inside the wing. Because look at the guys who did this. They didn't want to place the bomb in the landing gear bay, because that's a place that gets checked. So there is, I know for sure, I spoke to someone in particular, where sometimes when there are threats, the landing gear bay, sometimes there are notes to go check it every time. Because sometimes it's difficult, especially with the Legacy. You literally have to lie down to see it. All right, when the ground is wet, dirty, and the guys are wearing uniforms and everything, it's not easy to go do it. But it's something they could do, especially since there's another problem. Since the landing gear doesn't have a door, it's like on the 737. If the perpetrators had placed a bomb there, some of the blast would have escaped outside, reducing its effectiveness. So it might have required even heavier equipment, but since they put it inside the wing at that moment, they didn't need a mega charge. A relatively small charge would blow. The wing panels, you can actually see the missing wing panels when you look at the wing in the forest. And also, it caused the wing to tear off because there are enormous aerodynamic forces on it. We're at cruising altitude, we're at a high speed, we're near the limits of the plane's speed. So that's where there's really a lot of force on the wing. Suddenly an explosion rips off panels. That caused the complete tearing off of the wing and therefore the total loss of control of the aircraft. So, on the wheels of the aircraft, you won't see any impact marks on the tire. Why? If you look closely at how it's made, you'll see our landing gear. When retracted, it's lying down here. This is the shock absorber, or the arm of the landing gear. Here, this is the landing gear that's lying here. We have the other landing gear that's lying here. Okay, and actually, the bomb wasn't placed there. It was passed through this partition, and it was placed somewhere in there. Okay, so at the moment when, maybe even there, potentially. All right, Nita. That I have a similar device in front of me to tell you, so maybe it was placed there. So when it explodes, you see there's a gap between it and the tire. All right, so between it and the tire, we have all this shock absorber here, all right, all this axle, and we have this metal partition here, all right, which means the tire is protected from the explosion. That's why it's relatively intact. We won't find any traces of explosion on it, but since the landing gear was opened, probably here, we'll find traces of explosives. We can see some of it on the wing. Here's what we have. We have an operation that is, from a military standpoint, very interesting because it's an operation not only to strike the target. The head of Wagner aimed to send a strong psychological message. The guys behind are saying they can find you anywhere. Subtitles ST-501. You'll see people die. That means the message is extremely strong. It created insecurity within the Russian establishment because they got all the way to Moscow airport and then they placed a bomb on a plane and then they blew it up whenever they wanted. So who did that? It's hard to know. I think potentially the same people who blew up the Nord Stream pipes, the Nord Stream pipelines. If you look at Nord Stream 2, it exploded, and I think those guys have a thing for explosives. So obviously it's probably the same people. All right. And especially since it happened at a time when the Russians or Russia really needed that Wagner team the most. So there you go. So we'll see what the future tells us. We'll see what the investigation reveals. Even if I tell you this just between us, I'm not completely sure there will be a transparent investigation. And all of this because I think national interests and sensitivities are involved. Because honestly, if we look at it here, I would say the Russians really got screwed over. Because here, the guy who blew up Nord Stream, I get it. Because Stream, it's offshore, it's in international waters, where you can't monitor every meter of a pipe that's under the ocean. There, we want to understand that's reasonable. But when they get all the way to your place, in your airport, hidden in an alarm clock, that you only check once on a plane that's piloted, well, that carries very important people in the army or in the Russian military system. And I mean, at that point, anything is possible, right? Tomorrow, anyone could jump on anything. Guys, at this rate, they're going to start finding each other dead. Okay, it's a bit much. It's a bit. But, well, the people who did this clearly knew what they were doing, because the dosage, notice the amount of explosive, the placement, the precision of the timing of the explosion. Honestly, it's literally occult art. It's really ugly. It's really ugly. It's a real piece of crap. But at the same time, you can see that, technically speaking, purely technically, there's still a lot of know-how behind it. These are very serious people who did this. I'll leave you now, my friends. I hope we've covered this topic. I won't hesitate to come back to it if there's anything new, as they say. Even though, honestly, I doubt there will be much new, but we'll see. Thank you, my friends, for following along and for your trust. Let me share something. I don't watch the other channels and I don't watch them, even though I appreciate them. I respect them. In particular, I might watch another aviation channel. That's not the point. But when it comes to making a video, I avoid watching other channels and seeing what they say about it. I prefer to work with what is called raw data. I look at the raw data, I go to the source, I take the data, I analyze it, I make a video. I don't want to look at the others before doing this, because otherwise I would have a bias, I would be influenced, all right? And so when you watch the videos I make, sometimes they might go along with the consensus of others, sometimes not. But in both cases, it's purely accidental. It's purely by chance, because there's actually no connection. All right, thank you, my friends, for watching this video until now, and for your trust and all the support you give me. See you very soon. A bias, I would be influenced, all right? And so when you watch the videos I make, sometimes they might go along with the consensus of other people. Sometimes they don't. But in both cases, it's purely accidental. It's purely by chance, because there's no connection, actually. Okay? Thank you, my friends, for watching this video up to this point, and for your trust and all the support you give me. See you very soon.